There's a smell to a secret that old. It's not the must of old books or the sweet decay of incense that lingers in the public halls. It's the scent of iron and ozone, of something electric sealed in stone for too long. It's a smell that tells you some doors are locked for a reason, and you should thank God you don't have the key. For 12 years, that was the air I breathed. My name is Franco, and I was a member of the Pontifical Swiss Guard. Most people see the ridiculous uniforms, the polished halberds, the stone-faced ceremony. They think we're a tourist attraction, a historical reenactment with live actors. They're wrong. We are the oldest active military unit in the world, and our purpose is deadly serious. The halberd is for ceremony, yes, but the SIG sour pistol under my tunic is not. We are the last line of defense. And I'm not talking about protecting the Holy Father from a crazed assassin. Our true duty, the one we take an oath of blood and silence to uphold, is to protect the world from the secrets the Vatican keeps. The night it happened began with the familiar, heavy quiet. A cold Tuesday in November, the kind of night where the damp air makes the marble floors of the Holy See weep. The last of the evening prayers had echoed through St. Peter's, and the great bronze doors were being sealed. I was on the late watch, a 4-hour rotation of absolute stillness, stationed near the Cortile del Pappagallo. The air was dead. The only sound was the distant, muffled hum of Rome and the almost imperceptible crackle of my own radio, a comforting whisper in the crushing silence. Then the call came. It wasn't a standard alert. It wasn't a security breach or a medical emergency. It was a single, coded phrase from a channel we almost never used. A channel so restricted, most of the younger guards didn't even know it existed. A channel reserved for what the old manuals called a contingenza acoustica, an acoustic contingency. I'd been a guard for 8 years and had never heard it used. My blood didn't just run cold. It felt like it turned to ice in my veins. The protocol was simple, and that's what made it so terrifying. No questions. You don't ask what's happening. You drop everything. You move. My partner, Leo, a man whose face was carved from alpine granite and who rarely showed any emotion beyond mild disapproval, just looked at me. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. They were wide, pupils dilated in the dim corridor light. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, as if the very air had become a hostile listener. The voice on the other end hadn't been frantic or panicked. It had been unervingly calm, almost reverent, like a priest speaking the holiest words of Mass. Protocol Umbra is now active. Seal the archives. I repeat, Protocol Umbra is active. Seal the archives. No entry, no exit. Acknowledge. We acknowledged. Protocol Umbra. The Shadow Protocol. We drilled for it, of course, in windowless concrete rooms deep beneath the barracks, using maps of corridors we weren't supposed to know existed. But it was always spoken of in the abstract, a hypothetical for a threat that couldn't possibly be real. It meant something had been activated. Something had been heard. Something that wasn't supposed to make a sound. Ever. As we moved, running on silent feet towards our rally point, the ancient silence of the Vatican was shattered. Not by alarms or sirens, but by the disciplined, frantic energy of men who knew the legends were true. Heavy iron doors that hadn't been closed in a century grown shut, their locking mechanisms grinding away rust and time. Steel grates, unseen for decades, dropped from hidden recesses in the frescoed ceilings, their impact shaking the very foundations. We weren't just locking down a building. We were sealing a tomb. We were moving towards the heart of it all, the Vatican secret archives. But we weren't going in. Our orders were to form a tight, impenetrable perimeter around the exterior entrances. We were a thin line of modern steel and ancient faith against what? We didn't know. And that was the most terrifying part of all. We were guarding a door, and the threat wasn't on the outside trying to get in. It was already inside, and it was trying to be heard. You imagine the entrance to the Vatican secret archives to be something grand. A pair of towering gold doors, perhaps, guarded by angels carved from marble. The reality is far more terrifying. It's a single, featureless steel door at the end of a damp service corridor that always smells of bleach and cold stone. It's flush with the wall, painted the same drab beige, easily missed if you don't know what you're looking for. It's the kind of door that doesn't invite curiosity. It crushes it with sheer, bureaucratic indifference. It's the most important door in Christendom, and it looks like the entrance to a boiler room. That, I've learned, is how the Vatican hides its biggest secrets. Not in plain sight, but in plainness itself. As my unit took up our positions, forming a silent, lethal arc around that bland steel rectangle, the air itself began to curdle. It grew thick, heavy, like the atmosphere inside a diving bell as it sinks. The humidity spiked, and a cold sweat that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the environment broke out on my skin. And then came the smell. Faint at first, then surging in waves. Ozone, sharp and sterile like after a lightning strike. And something else beneath it, something ancient and organic. It was the scent of dust from a tomb that hadn't been opened in 4,000 years, the dry, brittle perfume of papyrus turning to powder. It was the smell of forgotten things, a smell of death so old it had forgotten its own name. We were under strict radio silence. Hand signals only. Every guard's face, illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights of the corridor, was a mask of rigid tension. That's when we felt it. A vibration coming up through the soles of our boots. It wasn't a tremor from the city's metro, not the shudder of an earthquake. It was a low, rhythmic hum, a frequency so deep it seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in your bones, in the fluid of your eyes. It made your teeth ache and the fillings in them buzz. It was a sound you felt more than heard. Our commander, a grim, battle-hardened man named Captain Valerius, stood with his back to us, facing the door. He was holding a small, lead-lined briefcase. Inside, we knew, was the Silentiarius, a device we were told was for detecting anomalous acoustic signatures. But among ourselves, we called it the Ghost Catcher. The legend was that it was designed by a Jesuit physicist in the 1950s, a man who believed that certain rituals, certain words spoken with enough power, could leave a permanent imprint on the very fabric of a place, a sonic residue. He believed that, under the right conditions, that residue could be woken up. And now, the light on the Silentiarius was blinking. A soft, violet pulse that cast strange, dancing shadows on Valerius's face. It was blinking in a steady, repeating pattern. A rhythm. A heartbeat. Leo, standing beside me, gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod towards the door. His knuckles were bone-white where he gripped the cold steel of his rifle. On the flat, beige surface of the door, a thin layer of condensation was forming, weeping in the cold, heavy air. But it wasn't random. It wasn't just moisture. It was coalescing into patterns. Symmetrical, geometric shapes that looked like a cross between a circuit board and ancient hieroglyphs. They would form, hold for a breathless moment, sharp and perfect as a snowflake, then dissolve back into a meaningless smear of moisture, only to reform in a new, more complex pattern. It was like watching a language write itself out of thin air. No one had opened that door. There was nobody inside, not officially. The archives are a climate-controlled, oxygen-deprived tomb, automated and sealed. At night, they were supposed to be silent, empty. But something inside was generating energy. Enough to create a sound we could feel, enough to change the atmosphere of a sealed corridor, enough to write on solid steel. That's when I truly understood. This wasn't about protecting books or scrolls. This was about containment. The Vatican's secret archives weren't a library. They were a prison. And the prisoners were not only awake, they were reminding us they still knew how to write. In the Swiss Guard, you learn that some threats have names. Not code names, but real names, whispered in the barracks after midnight when the wine has loosened tongues and softened discipline. They are the Vatican's ghost stories, the names of the things the Church fought in the dark so the world could live in the light. And the most feared name of all was not Lucifer or Belial. It was Custodes, the keepers. I never believed they were real, until the hum from the archives grew stronger, and the violet light from the Silentiarius went from a nervous pulse to a solid, screaming glow. Captain Valerius's voice crackled over a private channel, directed only to the team leaders, his tone stripped of all authority and filled with something that sounded like dread. Phase 2. The Custodes are en route. My heart hammered against my ribs. A small, unassuming service elevator, one used by the janitorial staff, whirred to life at the far end of the corridor. The doors slid open and two men stepped out. They were nothing like I imagined. No flowing robes, no ancient weapons. They wore simple, black clerical suits, so dark and perfectly tailored they seemed to absorb the light around them. They carried no weapons we could see, only two heavy, reinforced cases that looked like they held musical instruments. One was old, his face a roadmap of deep wrinkles, his eyes the color of faded parchment holding a terrifying, absolute calm. The other was younger, gaunt, with a coiled, predator's intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up. They moved with a liquid grace, their footsteps making no sound on the stone floor. They didn't acknowledge us, didn't even seem to see us. We were just part of the architecture to them. They walked directly to the humming steel door. The older one, whom Valerius addressed in a hushed tone as Monsignor, placed his hand flat against the steel, right over the shifting, intelligent patterns of condensation. He closed his eyes, his lips moving in a silent prayer or perhaps a command. The hum from within intensified for a heartbeat, a painful, physical throb, and the symbols on the door flared into crystalline sharpness before vanishing completely. The Monsignor opened his eyes and spoke, his voice not loud, but carrying a weight that cut through the low-frequency thrum like a razor. "It's an echo," he said, to no one in particular. "They're not trying to get out. They're trying to answer something." He turned to Valerius, and for the first time, I saw our commander, a man who had faced down bomb threats and assassination attempts without flinching, look like a frightened child. "We're going in," the Monsignor stated. "Your men will hold this position. No matter what you hear, no matter what you see from this point forward, this door does not open. Is that understood?" Valerius simply nodded, his authority completely eclipsed. "Understood, Monsignor." The younger Custos knelt and opened one of the cases. It didn't hold a weapon. It held scrolls, ancient and yellowed, and a series of interlocking rods made of a dark, polished wood that seemed to drink the light. The Monsignor opened the second case. Inside, nestled in black velvet, was a single object, a tuning fork. It was made of a strange, milky white material that wasn't metal or bone, something that seemed to glow with its own faint, internal light. He took it, and without ceremony, he struck it against the heel of his hand. There was no sound, not a single vibration I could hear, but the effect was instantaneous and absolute. The bone-jarring hum that had filled the corridor, the pressure that had been building in my skull, vanished. It was as if he had hit the mute button on reality. The very air seemed to sigh in relief. He then stepped forward and tapped the silent, vibrating fork against a specific, unmarked point on the steel door. There was a soft, metallic click, and a section of the stone wall beside the door slid open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading straight down. The darkness in that stairwell was a living thing. It didn't just look dark. It felt like a physical presence, a void that drank the light from the corridor and gave nothing back. The two custodes gave us one last look, their faces unreadable, and then they descended into that absolute blackness. The stone panels slid shut behind them, leaving us alone again in the corridor. The immediate threat was gone, but the new silence they left behind was somehow far more terrifying than the noise had been. We were guarding a sealed door to a secret staircase, while two men went down into the dark, not to fight a monster, but to reason with an echo. The most dangerous silence in the world isn't the absence of sound. It's the pause before the real scream begins. For the next hour, there was nothing. The oppressive, bone-deep hum was gone. The air in the corridor was still, and the steel door remained just a door. A nervous calm, fragile as spun glass, settled over my unit. We checked our gear. We shifted our weight. We started to let ourselves believe the unbelievable, that two men had walked into the dark and switched off a ghost. We started to believe it was over. We were fools. It began as a whisper, so faint I thought it was the ventilation system or the blood rushing in my own ears. It was a single voice, a woman's, seeming to emanate not from the door, but from the ancient stone walls around us. It wasn't in Italian or Latin or any language I knew. The sound was melodic, impossibly ancient, and filled with a profound, soul-crushing sadness. Then another voice joined it, a man's, deeper and more guttural, speaking in a rhythmic chant. Then another, and another, and another, until the corridor was filled with a ghostly chorus of disembodied whispers, overlapping, intertwining, a tapestry of dead languages. None of them were intelligible, but all of them conveyed a single, overwhelming emotion, a desperate, agonizing longing. The radio in my ear crackled to life. It was Valerius, his voice tight as a wire. "Do not engage. Do not respond. Hold the line. They are testing the perimeter." Testing us? How? The whispers weren't just in the air anymore. They were inside our heads. It felt like icy fingers probing through my memories, searching for a weak spot, a fear, a regret. I saw a flash of my mother's face in the hospital, the moment the light went out of her eyes. I felt a pang of a childhood fear, the absolute certainty that something monstrous lived under my bed. The whispers were looking for a hook, a crack in the armor of our discipline. Leo, my stoic, unshakable partner, was sweating heavily, his eyes darting around the empty corridor as if tracking unseen figures. "Do you hear that?" he breathed, his voice strangled. "They're talking about the lake. The one where my brother—" Valerius's voice cut him off, sharp and cold as a shard of glass. "Guard. Focus on your orders. It is a projection. It is not real." But it felt real. The floor beneath us began to grow cold. Not just cool, but icy. A frost, delicate and intricate like a spiderweb, started to spread from the base of the sealed door, tracing crystalline patterns across the marble. The whispers grew louder, the dozens of voices suddenly coalescing, merging into a single powerful sound. A voice that was both masculine and feminine, ancient and young. It spoke one word, a word that ripped through the air with physical force. A word I somehow understood in the deepest part of my soul, though I had never heard it before. Silence. The single word slammed into us like a physical blow. The air in front of the door shimmered like heat haze. The fluorescent lights in the corridor flickered violently and died, plunging us into the blood-red glow of the emergency lighting. And in that sudden, hellish twilight, the whispers were gone. They were replaced by something infinitely worse. From behind the sealed door came a new sound. Not a hum, not a whisper. It was the sound of 1,000 scribes writing at once, the frantic, dry scratching of quills on an ocean of parchment. It was the sound of a storm of recorded history trying to break free. And beneath it, a slow, heavy heartbeat. Thump, thump, the sound of something impossibly large waking from a long, long slumber. That was what the custodes had gone down to face. Not a ghost, not a demon. It was the archive itself, the collective consciousness of every forbidden text, every secret history, every silenced voice trapped in those miles of shelving. It was alive, and we had just heard it wake up. The door in front of us wasn't just steel and stone anymore. It was the lid on a sarcophagus, and something inside was clawing at the lid. In a place like the Vatican, you come to believe that some things are absolute. The infallibility of the Pope, the sanctity of the Eucharist, the strength of a reinforced, consecrated, lead-lined steel door. That belief, like so many others, died that night in the blood-red emergency light. The steel door screamed, not a creak or a groan, but a high-pitched metallic shriek of tearing atoms. A hairline fracture appeared near the lock mechanism, a tiny black line from which the impossible cold seemed to pour like a liquid. The frantic scratching from inside stopped. The whispers ceased. Everything was replaced by a single, deafening, high-pitched tone, the sound of a pressure valve about to burst. We armed our weapons, falling back into training that felt laughably inadequate. What good is a rifle against a living idea? Against a sound that can tear steel? And that's when the whispers started again, but they had changed. They were no longer trying to probe or frighten us. They were begging, pleading for release, and they were offering us the world. The chorus of voices in my head was no longer a chaotic assault. It was a symphony of seduction. Voices of forgotten scholars, silenced poets, condemned mystics, souls trapped in ink and parchment for centuries. They promised knowledge, truth, the secrets of the cosmos, the cure for death. They showed me visions, not of my fears, but of my deepest, most private desires. I saw my father, whose lungs had failed him years ago, breathing easy on a sunlit porch. I saw the woman I'd loved and left behind to take my oath, her face free from the sadness I had put there. I saw a life of peace, a world without duty, a future where I was whole. It was a lie, a beautiful, perfect lie, crafted from the fabric of my own soul. It was a temptation so powerful it felt like a physical drug, a warm wave flooding my body, urging me to lower my weapon, to step forward, to just open the door. One of the younger guards, a good kid from Lucerne named Raphael, actually took a step. His eyes were glazed over, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "We have to let them out," he mumbled, his voice thick with awe. "They know the way back to how things were supposed to be." Before I could move, Leo grabbed him, spinning him around and slamming him hard against the corridor wall. The impact seemed to break the spell. "Snap out of it, Raphael," Leo roared, his voice cracking. "It's a trick. It's all a trick." But I could see the struggle in Leo's own eyes, the raw desire to believe the promises. We were all feeling it. We were the last line, and the line was about to break from the inside out. It was then that Captain Valerius made the choice. He turned his back on the screaming door and looked at us, his face a grim mask in the hellish light. He opened the lead-lined case again, but he didn't take out the silentiarius. He reached under a false bottom. Inside were 6 sleek, silver cylinders, each about the size of a cigar. He tossed one to me, and one to each of the other team leaders. "Contingency Omega," he said, his voice heavy with the finality of a death sentence. "Secondary charge. If that door comes down, you know the protocol." We knew. Contingency Omega was the Vatican's scorched earth policy, the ultimate secret kept from even most of the guard. The cylinders were compact thermobaric charges, designed not just to destroy, but to incinerate everything in a sealed environment. In seconds, they would turn the entire corridor and the entrance to the archives into a furnace hot enough to melt stone, vaporize steel, and erase every trace of whatever was inside. It would stop the entity. It would also kill all of us. There would be no record, no medals, just a tragic training accident deep in the bowels of the Holy See. We were not just guards anymore. We were sacrifices, standing there, my thumb on the arming switch of a device that would erase my own existence. I finally understood the true weight of my oath. We weren't there to protect a life. We were there to protect a secret. The groaning of the metal grew louder. The choice was no longer ours. It had been made for us centuries ago by the men who decided to bury this knowledge instead of burning it. All that was left was to pay the price. This is how you die in the service of a secret. Not in a blaze of glory, but in a cold, red-lit corridor, with your thumb on a switch, waiting for a command that will turn you and the truth into ash. The steel door screamed its final, tearing note. The high-pitched tone drilled into our skulls. The fracture near the lock began to spiderweb across the metal. My own voice joined the chorus in my head, a silent prayer of forgiveness. Valerius opened his mouth to give the command. This was it, the end. Then, nothing. As if a divine hand had reached down and severed the thread of reality. It was over. The high-pitched tone cut out, plunging the corridor into a silence so absolute it felt louder than the noise had been. The pressure on the door vanished. The hairline fracture, impossibly, sealed itself, leaving no trace it had ever been there. The frost on the floor didn't melt. It receded in a matter of seconds, sublimating into a fine, white mist that hung in the air like a ghost's breath and then simply disappeared. Silence. A true, profound, empty silence that felt heavier than stone. For a full minute, no one moved. No one breathed. We just stood there, our hearts pounding against our ribs, the silver cylinders still heavy in our hands. The service elevator at the end of the hall whirred. The doors slid open. The younger Custos stood there, alone. He looked like a man who had aged 1,000 years in a single hour. His face was bone-pale. A fresh cut bled freely from his lip, and his simple black suit was covered in a fine layer of gray dust that looked disturbingly like ash. He carried both of the heavy cases. He didn't look at us as he walked with a slow, heavy gait straight to Captain Valerius. "It is contained," he said, his voice a hoarse, empty rasp. "The echo has been quieted." Valerius looked past him into the empty elevator, his question hanging in the dead air. "And the Monsignor?" The young priest paused. He looked down at the floor for a moment before meeting our commander's eyes. There was an ancient, bottomless grief in his gaze, a sorrow that didn't belong in a man so young. "He chose to remain," he said softly, each word a carefully placed stone. "He has become part of the silence." He offered no other explanation. He didn't need to. In that moment, we all understood the horrifying transaction that had taken place in the dark. The Monsignor hadn't defeated the entity. He had paid its price. He had offered himself to the archive, his own consciousness becoming a new voice in that prison of souls to pacify the others. A willing sacrifice to restore the balance. We were ordered to stand down. A team of Vatican engineers in sterile white coveralls arrived, speaking in hushed tones, running scans on the door, reinforcing the seals with materials I didn't recognize. We were debriefed one by one in a windowless room, the silver cylinders taken from us as if they'd never existed. We were told, in a flat, official monotone, that what we experienced was a magneto-resonant event caused by a severe power surge in the archive's climate control systems. A story so absurd, so paper-thin, that it was clearly an order, never speak of this again. The official report would list a system malfunction. Case closed. The next day, I handed in my resignation. 12 years of service, ended by 12 minutes of truth. I couldn't stand there anymore, holding a halberd for the tourists, smiling for their cameras, knowing what truly lay sleeping beneath their feet. I left the Vatican. I left Rome. I never saw Leo or Valerius again. But I know that deep under the glittering, sunlit dome of St. Peter's, the silence is listening. The custodes are still on watch. And the largest, most dangerous collection of forbidden knowledge in the world isn't just a library. It's a tomb. And some nights, when the air is still and cold, I can still feel that hum in my bones, that echo of imprisoned voices, and I know that all we did that night was buy time. Because some secrets don't want to be kept. They want to be remembered, and they are very, very patient.